The neighborhood kids called him Trash Man Joe and laughed when he passed by their houses each morning. To them, he was just another old man in dirty coveralls who picked up garbage for a living, someone to ignore or make jokes about. They had no idea that the humble man pushing the waste truck had once been the most feared Green Beret operative in Special Forces history, trained to eliminate threats that governments couldn't officially acknowledge. Welcome to the Faces Behind Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden strength and unexpected heroism, tell me in the comments which city you are watching from today, and if you believe stories about overlooked heroes deserve to be heard. Hit that subscribe button. These are the voices that need our attention. Maple Street was the kind of suburban neighborhood where people took pride in their manicured lawns, spotless driveways, and the illusion that nothing bad could ever happen in their perfectly ordered world. Tree-lined sidewalks, well-maintained houses, and the comfortable distance that modern life created between neighbors who shared geography, but little else. Joseph Martinez had been collecting their trash for 15 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Not that any resident was keeping track to them, he was simply part of the municipal infrastructure, as reliable and unremarkable as streetlights or mail delivery. He arrived each Tuesday and Friday at 5:47 a.m. sharp, driving the same aging sanitation truck and wearing the same faded coveralls with Joe stitched above the pocket. He moved methodically from house to house, emptying bins with practiced efficiency, never making enough noise to wake sleeping families or disrupt the suburban tranquility. They paid premium property taxes to maintain. The residents of Maple Street found him utterly forgettable. A working-class man doing working-class work, invisible in the way that service employees were supposed to be. Some barely acknowledged his existence. Others treated him with the casual politeness reserved for people who served useful functions, but weren't considered worth knowing personally. The neighborhood kids were less diplomatic. To 12-year-old Danny Morrison and his friends, Joe was Trash Man, someone whose very presence reminded them of everything their parents had taught them to avoid becoming. They would snicker when he passed, make jokes about his old truck, and occasionally ask each other what someone had to do wrong in life to end up picking up garbage for a living. What none of them knew, what 15 years of careful invisibility had successfully concealed, was that Joseph Martinez had spent 12 years in the U.S. Army Special Forces, with 8 of those years operating as a Green Beret in classified missions across 3 different continents. The same steady hands that handled trash bins had once handled weapons and explosives in situations where America's interests required deniable operations. His morning routes weren't just about waste collection. They were reconnaissance patterns, threat assessments, and community monitoring that ensured he understood every entrance-exit and potential danger point in a neighborhood he had unconsciously sworn to protect. His aging sanitation truck contained more than standard equipment, and his modest apartment held possessions that would have surprised anyone who assumed they knew everything about a man based on his job title. But Joseph Martinez had spent 15 years perfecting the art of being overlooked, because overlooked men could live peaceful lives without anyone asking why a garbage collector seemed to know so much about situational awareness, tactical positioning, and crisis management. That strategy had worked perfectly until the morning when being overlooked was no longer an option. Tuesday, September 8th began like every other collection day on Maple Street. Joseph started his route at the north end of the neighborhood, working his way systematically through streets where most residents were still sleeping or just beginning their morning routines. At 6:23 a.m., he was loading bins behind the Chen family's house when he noticed Mrs. Chen peeking through her kitchen curtains with an expression that didn't match the peaceful suburban morning. She looked frightened, checking the street repeatedly like she was expecting something unpleasant. Joseph had been reading people long enough to recognize fear when he saw it. In his previous career, that skill had meant the difference between successful missions and dead operators. In his current life, it meant noticing when something was wrong in the neighborhood. He had spent 15 years protecting in his own quiet way. He finished loading the Chen's bins and moved to the next house, but kept Mrs. Chen's kitchen window in his peripheral vision. 47-years-old widow worked as a seamstress from her home, had lived on Maple Street for 8 years, never caused problems, always kept her property neat, treated him with more courtesy than most residents bothered to show. At 6:45 a.m., as Joseph was working his way down the opposite side of the street, a black SUV with tinted windows drove slowly through the neighborhood. Not unusual in itself, delivery vehicles, service workers, and lost drivers passed through regularly. But this vehicle made 2 complete circuits of the area, slowing down each time it passed. The Chen house, Joseph's training kicked in automatically. Vehicle surveillance, potential threat assessment pattern, recognition. The SUV's occupants were conducting reconnaissance, not looking for an address or making deliveries, and their target appeared to be Mrs. Chen. He continued his route with the same methodical efficiency he had maintained for 15 years. But now he was working with heightened awareness that had nothing to do with garbage collection and everything to do with skills he had hoped never to use again. At 7:15 a.m., the black SUV returned with 2 additional vehicles. All 3 parked at different points around the Chen house, positioning themselves in a way that suggested coordination and tactical thinking. Joseph Martinez finished emptying the last bin on his route, climbed into his sanitation truck, and made a decision that would end 15 years of carefully maintained invisibility. Instead of driving away to continue his route through other neighborhoods, he parked his truck 1 block from Maple Street and walked back to a position where he could observe the developing situation. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions about what was about to happen to Mrs. Chen. At 7:43 a.m., 6 men emerged from the 3 vehicles and approached Mrs. Chen's front door with the kind of coordinated movement that spoke of organized criminal activity rather than random neighborhood crime. They weren't trying to be subtle. This was intimidation, designed to be seen and remembered by anyone who might consider resisting similar future visits. Joseph recognized the pattern immediately. Protection racket, extortion operation, organized crime asserting territorial control. The kind of predatory behavior that thrived in communities where people minded their own business and assumed someone else would handle problems that didn't directly affect them. Through the Chen's front window, he could see Mrs. Chen backing away from the door as the men pounded on it with increasing aggression. Her neighbors were awake now, watching from behind curtains and closed blinds, but none of them were moving to help or even calling police. The front door opened, and Mrs. Chen appeared with the defeated posture of someone who had been dealing with this situation for longer than today. One of the men, clearly the leader, began speaking in tones that carried threat even from a block away. Joseph Martinez stood at the corner of Maple Street and made a choice that would reveal everything he had spent 15 years hiding. He walked directly toward the confrontation. Not hurrying, not running, just moving with the calm purposefulness of someone who had done this kind of work. Before, his hands hung naturally at his sides, his eyes swept the area with practiced efficiency, and his entire bearing shifted from invisible sanitation worker to something that made people instinctively step back. The neighborhood kids who had called him Trashman Joe were watching from Danny Morrison's bedroom window, and they couldn't understand what they were seeing. The boring old man who picked up their garbage was walking toward 6 obvious criminals, like he was going to a business meeting. "Joe's going to get himself killed," Danny whispered to his friends. "Those guys look like gang members." But as Joseph got closer to the Chen house, something became clear that changed everything. The watching neighbors thought they knew about their invisible garbage collector. He was walking like a victim approaching danger. He was moving like a predator who had identified his prey. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Joseph said as he reached the group of men threatening Mrs. Chen. His voice carried the same polite courtesy he used when greeting residents, but there was something underneath it that made everyone stop talking and look at him. "This is private business, old man," the leader replied with dismissive aggression. "Keep walking unless you want problems." Joseph smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both friendly and absolutely terrifying. "I am walking," he said quietly. "I'm walking over here to explain why you are going to leave Mrs. Chen alone and never come back to this neighborhood." The 6 men laughed, but their laughter had an edge of uncertainty. Something about the way this garbage collector stood, the way he held himself. The complete absence of fear in his demeanor didn't match what they expected from a random civilian interfering in their business. "You got a death wish, garbage man?" the leader asked, stepping closer to Joseph with the kind of aggressive posturing designed to make normal people back down. Joseph's response redefined everything the neighborhood thought they knew about the quiet man who had been invisible for 15 years. "Probably," he said calmly, "but I buried that wish in Afghanistan about 20 years ago. Right now, I'm just explaining your options." What happened next lasted less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes revealed that Joseph Martinez was not and had never been just a garbage collector. The confrontation began when the gang leader reached inside his jacket, presumably for a weapon that would end this conversation with the kind of violence that had been working for him in other neighborhoods. He never got the chance to draw it. Joseph moved with speed and precision that seemed impossible for a man his age doing his job. In a series of movements too fast for the watching neighbors to fully process, 6 armed men found themselves disarmed, restrained, and lying face down on Mrs. Chen's front lawn, while a sanitation worker in dirty coveralls stood over them with the kind of calm competence that belonged to someone who had done this many times before. Mrs. Chen, Joseph called out, not taking his eyes off the subdued men, "Please call 911 and tell them you need police for 6 individuals involved in extortion and illegal weapons possession. Tell them Officer Martinez requested assistance. Officer Martinez, not garbage collector." Martinez, Officer Danny Morrison, and his friends watched from the bedroom window as their boring trash man Joe coordinated with arriving police units like he had been doing it his entire life. He provided clear, concise reports. He knew proper restraint procedures. He spoke with officers using terminology that suggested extensive law enforcement or military experience. Most importantly, he handled the entire situation with professional competence that left veteran police officers asking questions about his background. "Sir," the lead responding officer asked as EMTs checked the subdued gang members for injuries, "what is your experience with situations like this?" Joseph hesitated for a moment, glancing at the growing crowd of neighbors who were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to dawning recognition. For 15 years he had successfully hidden who he was. For 15 years he had been just another working-class man doing an honest job in a neighborhood where people valued predictability over curiosity. For 15 years he had convinced everyone around him that he was exactly what he appeared to be. But some situations don't allow for anonymity. "Special Forces," Joseph said quietly. "Green Beret, 12 years active duty. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in places I can't discuss. Specialized in counter-terrorism and threat elimination." The silence that followed was profound, not just from the police officers but from the neighborhood residents who had gathered to watch the conclusion of something they couldn't quite believe had happened on their peaceful suburban street. Green Beret Danny Morrison's voice carried from his bedroom window loud enough for everyone to hear. Trash man Joe was Special Forces. Joseph looked up at the house where the kids who had mocked him for 15 years were now staring with expressions of awe and embarrassment. "Just Joe," he said with the same quiet courtesy he had always shown. "I pick up trash on Tuesdays and Fridays. Everything else is just background." Mrs. Chen approached him with tears in her eyes and words in a language he didn't understand, but gratitude needs no translation. The neighbors who had watched from their windows began emerging from their houses, looking at their invisible garbage collector like they were seeing him for the first time. Because they were. The story of what happened on Maple Street spread through the neighborhood faster than official police reports could be filed. By evening, everyone within a 6-block radius had heard about the garbage collector who turned out to be a decorated Special Forces veteran. But the most significant change wasn't in how neighbors viewed Joseph Martinez. It was in how they began treating each other. Mrs. Chen, no longer isolated by fear and intimidation, became a central figure in a neighborhood watch program that actually watched out for each other instead of hiding behind closed doors. When problems arose, Danny Morrison and his friends, faced with the reality that they had spent years mocking a genuine American hero, began volunteering to help elderly residents with yard work and grocery shopping. Not because they were ordered to, but because they had learned something about the difference between judging people by their jobs and understanding their character. The other residents discovered that their boring neighborhood had been kept safe for 15 years by someone they had never bothered to know, and that realization changed how they thought about the value of the people who worked around them every day. Joseph continued his Tuesday and Friday routes, still arriving at 5:47 a.m. sharp, still wearing the same coveralls with Joe stitched above the pocket, but now residents waved when he passed. Kids asked about his military service. People learned his last name and started conversations that went beyond polite nods. Mr. Martinez, Danny Morrison said one Tuesday morning, approaching the garbage truck with the nervous respect of someone who had learned an important lesson. "I wanted to apologize for calling you Trash Man Joe and being disrespectful." Joseph looked at the 12-year-old boy who had spent years treating him like he was invisible and smiled with genuine warmth. "Danny," he said, "you know what I learned in the Army? The most important job anyone can do is the job that needs doing, regardless of whether other people think it is important. I pick up trash because communities need clean neighborhoods. You go to school because communities need educated citizens. Neither of us should be ashamed of doing necessary work." "But you were special forces," Danny said. "That is way more important than being a garbage collector." Joseph finished loading a bin and turned to face the boy directly. "I spent 12 years in the military protecting people I had never met in places I couldn't talk about. For the last 15 years, I have been protecting people I see every week in a neighborhood I chose to call home. Both jobs matter. Both jobs serve the community. The uniform is different, but the mission is the same." Danny nodded with the kind of understanding that comes when young people realize that adults are more complicated and more valuable than they had previously imagined. Joseph Martinez continued working for the municipal sanitation department, but everything about how Maple Street functioned changed after September 8th. He still collected trash twice a week, still arrived before dawn to avoid disrupting the neighborhood routine. But now he did those things as himself, without the careful invisibility he had maintained for 15 years. Neighbors who had previously treated him like part of the municipal infrastructure began asking his opinion about community safety, seeking his advice about home security, and occasionally sharing concerns that went beyond garbage collection schedules. Mrs. Chen started a small community garden where neighbors could grow vegetables together, and Joseph found himself serving as an unofficial security consultant for neighborhood events and gatherings. The kids who had once called him Trash Man Joe began referring to him as Mr. Martinez and started asking questions about military service, personal responsibility, and what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. "He taught us that you can't judge people by their jobs," Danny Morrison told his parents 6 months later. "He taught us that important work doesn't always look important, and that heroes don't always look like what you expect." Joseph had spent 15 years hiding from his past, convinced that his military service was incompatible with the peaceful civilian life he wanted to build. What he discovered was that service took many forms and that protecting people didn't always require carrying weapons or wearing uniforms. Sometimes it meant being the reliable man who showed up twice a week to keep the neighborhood clean, who noticed when something was wrong, and who had the skills to handle problems when peaceful communities faced threats they weren't equipped to manage. He had traded combat boots for work boots, but he had never stopped being a guardian. He had just found a different way to serve and protect. The day of the confrontation, the residents of Maple Street learned that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they spend years quietly taking care of the details that keep your world functioning, asking for nothing more than the opportunity to do honest work for decent people. And sometimes when everything goes wrong, those quiet guardians turn out to be exactly the heroes your community needed all along. At the Faces Behind Stories, we believe that extraordinary people often choose ordinary work not because they lack other options, but because they have found meaning in serving their communities without needing recognition or status. Have you ever discovered that someone you overlooked was actually remarkable in ways you never imagined? Share their story in the comments below. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel. We are here to remind you that heroes work among us every day, usually without anyone noticing until the moment their courage becomes essential. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.